Yeah, and this is it's not a universal trope, but this idea that the Book of Judges is arranged as a downward spiral. I think if you've read basically anything on Judges in the past 40 years or so, you've probably come across this phrase, the downward spiral of Judges, or the book is arranged as a kind of deteriorating moral state with ancient Israel and the tribes of Israel.
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. Today's guest is Brandon Hurlbert, and we will be discussing his article from the Journal of Biblical Literature, Deconstructing the Downward Spiral, Anthology as Coherence in the Book of Judges. Brandon is one of, I believe, 17 hosts or team members. I'm not really sure how they want to be characterized. Of the Two Cities podcast. It's also a blog, I think. One of the other team members over there, John Dunn, has been a guest on the podcast. And now that I realize there's so many of them, I kind of want to try to catch them all and get them on here, just because I think it would be an interesting challenge. I am a little bit jealous that I did not snatch up anybody to help me with producing this podcast, but at this point, it's too late. As always, if you have feedback for me or guest suggestions, please reach out at itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. If you are an adherent of a specific tradition that engages with biblical texts through your liturgy or belief or individual devotional practices, hit me up and give me recommendations for anyone you might want me to talk to regarding your tradition and its background. 2 episodes are out already in Greek Orthodoxy and Orthodox Judaism. And I want to cover every single tradition that engages with biblical text at least once. So I look forward to hearing from you guys on that. Don't forget, $5 a month on Patreon gets you episodes a week early. So the preview at the end of this episode would already be available to you today if you're listening the day that this episode is released. That's enough from me. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Brandon Hurlbert. Brandon Hurlbert, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Before we get going, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I am born and raised in Southern California. That's where I did my undergrad, my master's, and married out there and moved with my wife here to bright and beautiful, sunny Durham, England. If you've ever been there, you would know it's neither bright nor sunny. But I came here to do my PhD in the Book of Judges, reading the Book of Judges as Christian scripture, and have somehow managed to stay for this is the third year teaching in the theology and religion department. And I mainly teach Old Testament and Hebrew and some other classes.
Cool. And so we've decided to observe Election Day together. So we're going to be breaking down the 2024 presidential election, right? No, so we'll be
a breakdown is certainly going to happen on this podcast, but I don't know if it's about the election.
So it's also gray here in Houston, Texas, this November 5th, 2024. But actually, we'll be discussing your Journal of Biblical Literature article, Deconstructing the Downward Spiral, Anthology as Coherence in the Book of Judges. So just jumping right into it, I prefer to start with the thing that you're asserting over and above the thing that you are going against. So if I understand correct, you're asserting that Judges is an anthology of narratives, and there is an antithesis to that you're attempting to tackle. Do you mind breaking down your thesis and then going into that alternative?
So I suggest that as readers, we have the freedom to approach this text as an anthology, And by an anthology, I have in mind something like The Twilight Zone or maybe Black Mirror, if you are familiar with those shows, where there is kind of a collection of stories that can be read and appreciated and cherished or hated on their own terms, and yet they find a larger coherence because they are all situated within the same moral and literary universe. And so that's what can account for the kind of literary coherence or kind of shared themes throughout the text, word choices that are shared in various stories, but then also appreciate kind of the discontinuity between the stories or the differences in the way the narrator constructs a story or the themes that it's trying to present. We can appreciate both the differences and the coherence, and we can do that by treating the text as an anthology.
Okay. As opposed to kind of a unified narrative that is working toward moral descent or decay. I'm not really sure how you want to characterize that. That's the alternative, right?
Yeah, and this is it's not a universal trope, but this idea that the Book of Judges is arranged as a downward spiral. I think if you've read basically anything on Judges in the past 40 years or so, you've probably come across this phrase, the downward spiral of Judges, or the book is arranged as a kind of deteriorating moral state with ancient Israel and the tribes of Israel. And that this downward spiral shows up in the stories, but also in the narrative structure. And so there's some structural elements that are kind of put in place by either the Othniel cycle, so in Judges 3, beginning of chapter 3, or in the prologue itself, which is in Judges 2, which kind of outlines what's about to happen in the book. And there's certain structural elements that show up at the earlier stage of the book and then kind of deteriorate towards the end. And this might explain why the Samson narrative, which happens from chapters 13 to 16, look very different and are a lot longer and more complex and I think more fun personally, but look very differently than the kind of earlier, more quote unquote pristine narratives of the early Judges' stories. And so this downward spiral is both kind of a structural way of reading the text, but also on the kind of, in the narratives itself, it seems like Israel's devotion to the Lord gets worse and worse as the text goes on. And this is a one way of reading kind of the book of Judges as a coherent text.
So you say coherent. Are these texts a collection of different story? Like, are they disparate stories? Is that part of your thesis, and is that not necessarily a part of the downward spiral thesis?
Yeah, so maybe it might be help to back up and explain just a little bit about kind of how Judges was interpreted very briefly through the centuries. So Judges, the individual stories of Judges, throughout time have always been appreciated on their own terms. So there's very little connection being drawn between them in the kind of reception history, and then within the and there doesn't need to that doesn't necessarily need to be an issue. It just is the way that people read text. Especially if you're preaching on the book of Judges, you might just preach on one story and then move on to the next story, and that's just kind of how people read the text. In the kind of 19th and early 20th century, people tended to see these as kind of made up of various sources, and so there were these kind of the narratives didn't necessarily cohere with one another. There's also these kind of underlying traditions, and so you can see that a bit in the list of minor judges that come. There's that come in chapters 10 and 12. there's only a little bit of information about them, and so that maybe that taps into this underlying tradition, and so there's the texts are kind of an accumulation of those traditions. And so that's kind of generally how the text was read, and basically there's not really any coherence between the narratives. And some, people kind of just assumed they used the word. Sometimes we'd use the word anthology, but they would mean it in a kind of like these are haphazardly arranged. It's just a kind of throw all these texts together in a book and ship it out. But the downward spiral and specifically more literary approaches to the text that end up happening in the 1960s, they saw a deeper connection between these stories that made them think that this was not a haphazard collection of texts, but was trying to communicate, a central theme. And that, there's various proponents of that. But this kind of lays the groundwork for this kind of creation of, oh, it's actually not just the book is not cyclical, as in, there's these cycles of apostasy and then being um, um, there's not there's not only there's these cycles of apostasy or being oppressed, then crying out to the Lord and being delivered, right, which is what we see happen in each of these stories. But really, it's not necessary. It's not only cyclical, but it is a downward spiral that these texts get worse and worse, and that's kind of the overarching structure or way of reading these texts that end up getting developed in the 1980s and becomes really popular. And until today, basically everyone, or not necessarily everyone, but the vast majority of readers have taken this for granted that, yeah, of course, the book is arranged as a downward spiral, and we should, keep reading it that way.
I think I'm trying to wrap my head around what the spectrum of points of view on its origin may be, because I know, where I grew up, it was essentially equivalent to saying like, well, first George Washington, and then, and it's following or it's accounting or recounting an historical narrative. And then
Mm-hmm.
so you're saying the downward spiral is I guess you could also say anthology, but it's aimed at making this point through a literary sense. And then there's you didn't use this term, but documentary hypothesis, which is like it's a collage almost of just all these different people, different cooks getting their hands in the pot and making changes over time. Uh, and I wonder, are you throwing a fourth perspective in there as far as the origin of the text?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think I see the text as more of a collage, more of a kind of a text that contains within it a lot of various traditions, origin stories, and it seems like more of a kind of a growth, a literary growth to these traditions, um, and these were, I think, edited together at various points. I think there's probably not it's not just me, as other scholars as well, but that there's various maybe prior additions to the Book of Judges that we can still see. So maybe just looking at the text itself, you have these central stories of Judges, chapters 3 through 16, which you have Othniel through Samson. And then you kind of have at the beginning, chapters 1 and 2, kind of like this almost a continuation of Joshua. And then he dies twice somehow. And then you kind of get this prologues about what's, the Judges period is going to look like. And then at the end, 17 to 21, you have this other kind of collection of stories, generally arranged into two parts, that focus on priests who don't end up doing the right thing all the time, or Levites who don't do the right thing all the time, and things go terribly wrong there. So it seems like there is a kind of editorial process that's happening. I think we can't be certain of when this is taking place or at for how many stages of that. I think a lot of that is speculation. which I'm happy to participate in. But I think we really can't know some of these questions that I think I really wish we did know the answer to these questions. That would make our lives a lot easier. But I think what it does is it allows us a kind of an interpretive freedom to approach the text in a variety of ways. And so one of these ways that I think to me is more compelling than the downward spiral reading that I'm arguing against is that these texts are an anthology. They can be approached on their own terms, and yet they share coherence. So I'm really trying to have my cake and eat it too, where I can see that there's differences between the stories and the editorial layers, but also understand that there's some coherence at a later and more editorial level, and that is not in a downward spiral, but is in a anthology in which they're all trying to communicate something about the moral character of ancient Israel.
So, practically speaking, what is that editorial process? Because I know I have a very 20th, 21st century concept of what an editor is and does, and I have a like a modern printing understanding of how texts are created and reproduced. But can you spend a little bit of time explaining what that process looks like practically?
I can. I'm probably not the best person to do that, but
Of
no,
of
yeah,
of the two people in this conversation, you absolutely are.
yeah. Well, no, this is no because you've tapped into a really important and really critical question. Is because it's really complicated. Because you're right, we don't, we're so used to, copy and paste. If I want to switch things around, or if I want to, just print it off. Like no, ancient scribal activity is really interesting and fascinating and complex, and I'm certainly not the best person to talk to about it. Um, so if they are listening to your podcast, I apologize if I mess anything up. But I think we have to remember that you have to make your own supplies. You have to create papyrus. If you're working with papyrus, you have to create your own ink. You have to create your own writing utensils, and that's just before you even start working. And then at some point you have to start writing these texts. And so the way that the Book of Judges, or a lot of these biblical texts or ancient texts, how they get edited, is again a very is a great question that I just don't know if we know the answer to. Um, it seems to me, at least within the Book of Judges, that you have um, various local traditions within the various tribes, and so you have a story of Ehud, and then you have another story of Deborah and Barak, and maybe you have a narrative story and then a poetic version, or vice versa. And you have these local traditions, and at some point, maybe they're oral, maybe they're written down. At some point, someone is coming together and bringing all of these disparate traditions together, and that brings a certain level of coherence. And then at another point in the kind of understanding of the textual history is the Deuteronomistic history, which you may or may not be familiar with, but is this another level of coherence that sees that there is a certain type of historian that's editing together and rewriting ancient Israel's history from Deuteronomy to Kings as a way of trying to explain or grapple with the reality of exile. And this gets complicated, and and this hypothesis gets supplemented for a very long time in very different ways that are too complex for right now. But and I'm not really interested in it right now either. But this kind of creates another kind of version, and it seems like after the exile, then maybe there's other kind of ideas and thoughts that are kind of working their way into the text and helping shape it. But all we can look at is what we have today as kind of the received form of this text, and grapple with what it says. And it seems like it didn't all just come out neatly packaged like we have it. It seems like there's layers to it, but it still exists in as a kind of a coherent work, because it's together, and I don't think it's haphazardly arranged. But neither do I think that it tells one, overarching story that is arranged in a downward spiral, which is what people have been thinking about this text since the 1980s.
And look, that's fair. I think the complexity of it all that's what I was looking for. And I think a good example of that is I didn't realize how much the Lord of the Rings movies had taken over my brain, and I've been re-listening to Tolkien stuff lately, and it was 10 years. 10 years before, or more than 10 years actually, before the journey began, right? Like the Bilbo's 11st birthday, Frodo's 33, and he doesn't leave until he's 50. And it just like the speed that things happen with in our brains is probably not how they happened. And so the idea that over the course of maybe centuries, for sure,
Definitely.
that this what we call book was crafted for a lot of different reasons, I think is helpful to your thesis, rather than like treated more of as like a literary version of a systematic theology to prove a point that there's only this one point. I just felt like that was helpful. So I'm sorry for the digression on your behalf, or to you, to force you to digress. However, for the audience to explain that like this is a complicated thing, the way that this was put together. And now
Yeah.
I'll jump back over to your article if you prefer.
Can I add another example I think is helpful here? Is that at certain parts in the book of Judges, specifically in 19 through 21, which is kind of the ending of the book, and it's really horrific. And there's gender-based violence, there's a genocide, and then there's more genocide and more gender-based violence. So, not a great ending by any means, but a lot of times it seems to poke fun or make fun of the house of Benjamin, which is where Israel's first king Saul comes from. And so it seems like there's an anti-Benjaminite polemic. There's also an anti-Saulide polemic. And in other parts, Judah seems to be, in parts of the text, Judah seems to be looked at favorably. And that might seem to be a pro-Davidic or pro-Judah, Judahite polemic buried within the story. It's not exactly clear on the surface, but if you kind of try to read behind the text and to kind of see the ideology that's producing the text, maybe we can sense that. Now that seems really interesting, because it seems like people have used that to kind of suggest, well, maybe this is a text being written or edited during the events of 2 Samuel 1 through 5, which is basically right when Saul dies and David ascends. There's kind of a almost like a Game of Thrones almost between, or Lord of the Rings or something, where it's the house of Saul versus the house of David, and they're fighting, and maybe this text is meant to kind of be some political propaganda to kind of make fun of Saul and say this is why we should vote for David. Or obviously they didn't vote, but you know what I mean. It's the election day, right? And maybe that might explain certain elements in the story. However, those texts, or I would say that those texts are really only relevant for that short period of time. And part of, at least my own kind of approach to these texts is to read them as Christian scripture. You can read them as Jewish scripture as well, or not scripture at all. But for me as a Christian, I want to read them as Christian scripture. And part of that wants to see the kind of ongoing or enduring value of these texts and on the life of faith today. And so part of what I kind of think about these is that they've been recontextualized in a larger literary work, and in doing so, they take on additional meanings that go beyond their originating context. And so, while certain parts of the text might look like anti-Benjaminite, anti-Saul propaganda, within this recontextualized work, within this larger literary collection or anthology, they can take on additional meanings, which is I think why they've continued to be transmitted and copied and preserved and they endure as Jewish and Christian scripture today is because other later communities of faith continued to find value in them and continued to read and appreciate them as scripture.
So I remember, and listeners, you can go back and hear this conversation, but Jody Magnus had an article about toilets and toilet humor in the story of Ehud in Judges. Is there a lot of comedy? Like, are there several threads of comedy throughout Judges?
I think it depends on what you find funny. Obviously, some people love toilet humor, and then there's I think some funny things that happen in the Ehud story. But I think there's a lot of irony as well within that story. Also within uh, the Deborah and Barak story with Yael or Jael, killing Sisera with a tent peg. I think there are plenty of funny things. I mean, there's within the Abimelech story, there's a lot of funny things that happen. I mean, they're not quite funny, but like they're deeply ironic. And I have an article coming out shortly, co-edited with a friend, or co-written with a friend, about drunken speech in the Abimelech story and how this character named Gaul, who is causing trouble for Abimelech, he gives this speech and then no longer remembers it the next morning. And I suggest that it's actually meant to be like he's drunk, and some people might find that funny. Other people might not. I find it funny, but I find it ironic as well. So I think within the question of is there humor, I think humor is in the eye of the beholder. I think so, yes, but other people might not, and I want to. I understand why other people might not find certain things funny.
I mean, that is a very diplomatic answer, but I will say, to finish your thought, there are people who find toilet humor funny, and then there are liars, because it is funny. So I will transition back to your article. I don't want to take
Sure.
you down every. I mean, I'll do it all day if you
No, it's
let
great.
me.
I love
Uh,
Judges. I love it. So let's go.
and that's the hold on. So you're saying, it's in the eye of the beholder, but this is your area of expertise, and so in fairness to you, yeah, you do get to kind of say, I've done the work analyzing Judges, and there's funny stuff in it. So I didn't realize that there's a Benjamite joke because he's left-handed, right? Like, or
Yeah, well, yeah, that's one of the ironies. Benjamin means son of the right or son of the right hand, and he's left-handed. But I mean, if we get into Ehud, this is an enduring question because, and I'll have to go back and listen to this episode. But that you're mentioning, but with the Ehud story, it's actually an open question about whether or not he's left-handed or if he might be disabled. Because it just says he's bound in the right hand, so that might be that he's disabled. It might be that he is the Septuagint takes it as ambidextrous, so maybe he's actually a well-trained super assassin who can fight with both hands. This all changes the story, and this changes whether or not stabbing a big fat man in the world of the story, if you're a super trained assassin, is that funny? Maybe. It also might not be super funny. I mean, some people might find it funny, but other people might not find it funny to lie about having a word from God, and while the king stands in order to hear that word of God, you kill him. As a Christian, we're called to love our enemies, and that probably precludes stabbing those people as well. So, I think, and that kind of reading tradition about maybe putting a question mark on the appropriateness of Ehud's violence shows up in the rabbis as well. The Jewish tradition accords Eglon honor for standing to hear God's word, and that's why everyone else should stand to hear God's word, because if a Gentile king Eglon can do it, then you all can. But they afford Eglon honor, and say that because you stood to hear the word of God, you will always have someone on the throne, and Eglon's daughter, and in this midrash or Jewish understanding, is actually Ruth, the Moabite, and therefore Ruth then is in the lineage, great great grandmother of David, who is always said to have uh, a descendant on the throne. So whether or not we find the Ehud story funny, it depends on what kind of story we think it is. And there's a lot of variations in the, it's a very ambiguous story. And so one way of understanding the ambiguities does lead me to laugh. But another way of reading the text actually means it's quite a serious text. And these are questions around genre that I think are really important. And I could probably talk about Ehud for a lot longer, but I mean, just come back at me. Does that make sense? Is that
It does, and it's
helpful?
very on message with the look. It's complex, engaging with biblical texts in whatever as an individual, liturgically, academically, in a literary sense. It's complex. There's not necessarily an answer, which also I think goes against where I came from, which was like, nope, it means this, and that's what you have to get from it, which
Yeah,
is kind of what I think the downward spiral. I don't know that we talked enough about Judges when I was growing up to be
very
aware.
unlikely we
Yeah,
did.
yeah, and it might be largely because of that final scene, because it seems like there's not a lot of answers for like what is going on here in this weird Tarantino cartoonishly violent portion of this book.
Yes, my master's thesis, or one of my master's thesis, and then turned it into an article on biblical interpretation, was actually using Tarantino to help read Judges and his stylized violence to help us kind of you find language to talk about violence in Judges 19. So every time I read the Book of Judges, I think of Tarantino, and every time I watch Tarantino, I think of the Book of Judges. So spot on there.
Thank you. Um, okay, so if I'm not mistaken, the bulk of your article, transitioning to your article, because I really do want to give your work attention, because it's worth the attention. There are 8 tests that you use to evaluate the downward spiral thesis. So I guess first I'm curious, did you come up with these, or are these like an iteration of something that's used in biblical studies or in studying ancient texts more broadly?
These are kind of a compilation of tests. I mean, and essentially, it's tests I came up with, but they're based on what scholars said. So it was mainly taking assertions or suggestions by other scholars of Judges and just trying to see if they made sense. Because part of kind of how this is something that wasn't in my dissertation, but it was something I'd always had in the back of my mind. I just really wanted to write it. And so I had wrote an earlier version of this at SBL 2 years ago, and reworked it several times, and it came out a month or so ago. But yeah, these tests really came from my own kind of wrestling with the text. Is that people will say that there is a downward spiral, there is this level of coherence, and it's found in this, and they would make a suggestion. So one of those, and I could probably just work through those 8 tests rather quickly. Is the first test is that that the Othniel cycle in Judges 3:7-11 is paradigmatic for the rest of the book, so that the Othniel is the ideal judge by which we can evaluate all the other stories, because Samson is a rather ambiguous character. So how do we evaluate him when there may not be enough in data in the narrative to give a critical evaluation, because sometimes the text seems to critique him, other times it doesn't. So what are we supposed to do, right? And so forth for the rest of the judges. Well, with the downward spiral, you have a good suggestion. The good judges, or the less bad judges, are at the beginning of the book, and Othniel is the ideal one you can evaluate all the rest of them by. And as the book goes on and progresses, people will look like Othniel less and less. And so part of how I tried to evaluate that is just, and this is what other people had done, is they look at the structural elements of the judge's cycle. So generally, people have a variety of different ways of counting that. Sometimes it's 4, sometimes it's 6, sometimes it's 7, because obviously it has to be 7 because in the Bible. I use 11 because I wanted to be more thorough, but essentially, within the Othniel cycle, it's these points of, there's the Deuteronomistic intro. So, and Israel once again did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Then the Lord gets angry. Then and there's a verb, so he sells them in the Othniel cycle. He sells them into the hand of the enemy, or whoever is listed. And then Israel cries out. And then the Lord raises up. And what does he raise up? He raises up a savior, Messiah. So there's a title there. And then the Spirit of the Lord is upon him. And then he judged Israel. The land was quiet or had rest for a certain amount of years. And then the judge dies, right? So here's these 11 different structural elements. And the way to test whether or not Othniel was ideal, if the downward spiral exists, and this is the way the book is arranged, then you should see each subsequent judge scoring a little bit lower than each other, and Samson should score the worst on the scale of similarity, right? But as I have a chart that I've printed it out, and it's not as clear as I remember it being online. I will say that I had it color coded, and it was awesome, and it looked really great. But JBL said that we don't print color, so you can blame JBL for that. But it was nicely colored. But when you do that, you end up seeing that the scores don't actually look like a downward spiral. They kind of vary all over the place. And Ehud, the one that's the closest to Othniel, actually scores the lowest on the similarity score when compared to Othniel.
Yeah, I didn't realize that it should have been in color. That is,
no. When I sent the proofs off and I submitted it, it was in color.
yeah.
JBL said we have to change it. So
it should. Part of what really stood out to me is that you're asserting that, like, we don't have to think that these are coming in order either. Which also undercuts the thesis that they're all kind of working toward a final, low point. So can you talk about that? And does that affect, I guess, the scores? Could you say, well, okay, well, obviously these scores would be different if we take into consideration looking at the lowest, or sorry, not the scores would be different. The scores will determine the chronology. Is that possible?
That might be the case, but then that would equally disprove the downward spiral. So and not to kind of skip all of the tests, but that is kind of what I'm arguing in test 8, in that judges doesn't follow a strict chronology, which then complicates it. But maybe I should work through the rest.
If you'd like, I can read them off if you want, or if you want to work through them. That's
no, yeah. I'll just briefly explain what they are. So, this is just my case of test 1 was is Othniel paradigmatic for to score the other judges. The second one is really similar, which is using the judges cycle in the prologue, Judges 2:11 through 19, using that as a way to score the rest of the judges, including Othniel, and how similar are the rest of the text structurally to this prologue, which is what other people have also argued. And when you do that, again, it's not arranged in a downward spiral. The third test, I think, probably is more controversial, because it's a bit more subjective, which is that, do the actions of the judges actually get worse and worse as the book progresses? And so, as I already mentioned, Judges 19 to 21, absolutely the worst elements in the book. This is not, I'm not disputing that in any capacity. That's not normally included into the kind of downward spiral, which is generally just kind of the central chapters of the book, with the actual judges. But if you just kind of work through the text, you see that maybe Ehud is not really that bad, and Deborah and Barak isn't actually all that bad either. Though you kind of you have in this way of reading the text, you have to say that Deborah and Barak are worse than Ehud, which is generally why Barak is treated, as if he's being unfaithful to the Lord because he asks for Deborah to be with him. And then there's all this kind of way of reading that I don't particularly buy into. But then you get to Gideon, and Gideon does some good things, but then at the end he creates this idol, and all of Israel goes astray. And then you end up getting Abimelech, which is sometimes not included in the judges, sometimes is, but he commits fratricide and he kills 70 of his brothers. Is killing 70 of his brothers worse than idolatry? Well, that probably depends on if you're one of his brothers or not, and within the world of Deuteronomist, I don't think it is. I think idolatry is the kind of chief sin. Though I would say don't do either of them, personally. But then you get to Samson, and while he might be many things, he actually doesn't seem as bad as Jephthah, who sacrifices his daughter. He doesn't seem as bad as Abimelech, who fratricides, kills his brother, burns this whole city to the ground. He doesn't seem and Samson doesn't seem as bad as Gideon, who commits idolatry and creates an illicit cult. Samson, is not great, but he doesn't seem as bad. And so I feel like this is kind of the kind of drawing out the subjectivity of saying that one judge is worse than the other, as so many people end up doing. And when I've read the text, I've never really understood why one issue is worse than the other when they both kind of seem pretty bad. I don't know if you're meant to kind of evaluate this as on a sliding scale or as a downward spiral. You can come back to any of these points if you want to interrupt me.
No, you're good. Keep going.
Okay. Another test is, does the activity of Israel's God indicate a pattern of decay? So I just looked at how many times God is mentioned, and some people said the more that he's mentioned, the worse Israel is, and other people said the more he's mentioned, the better Israel is. And my analysis just shows that it doesn't follow any set pattern, and he's not more prevalent in one part of the book or less than in the other. So it just doesn't seem a good way to test the hypothesis of the downward spiral. Tests 5 through 7 just look at the length of oppression, the length of peace, or the length of judgeship. Some of this is in the literature, but basically they don't follow any discernible pattern, or they don't account for the entire book equally, which means that they're probably not the best way to determine if this is the case. But the kind of the longer section of the paper is devoted to test 8, which is to look at the chronology and the narrative time of the book of Judges, and do they support the downward spiral? And to make a long section really short, the book of Judges is not arranged chronologically, and we know that because of the ending of the book, chapters 17 through 21. Chapter 18 are one story of the relocation of the tribe of Dan from their tribal allotment in the south, or kind of closer in the middle part of Palestine, up to the north, where they conquer the city and call it Dan. And that's why Dan's in the north, even though Joshua said that he should be over there or somewhere else. But in that story, there's this dramatic reveal at the end, which this priest who is from Bethlehem, I'm now can't remember. I think he's from Bethlehem. This priest is going along and creates this illicit cultic shrine at Dan, and he's said to be the grandson of Moses. And it's this really dramatic reveal because what it ends up suggesting is that this story, this relocation of Dan to the north and this illicit tribe and this like what really awful story, actually happens at the beginning of the Judges period because that he would be in the first generation after the death of Joshua, which would takes place in Judges 1. Similar things happen in Judges 19 through 21, which we think is, and I agree, is absolutely the worst part of the whole book. But there again, it actually occurs within the world of the story. It occurs within the first generation of the text. And so what we can point to as the worst parts of the book actually begin at the beginning of the whole book, or beginning of the period of the book. And it then recontextualizes and dischronologizes the rest of the book. Now it looks like Samson might be a little bit closer to the start of the story rather than at its very end. And we can think about how other texts get changed. But this kind of understanding of the book that even just reading it, it doesn't actually flow chronologically. And if it doesn't flow chronologically, and the worst stories that we point to as the downward spiral points to as the worst stories, if they are actually occurring at the beginning of the book or the beginning of the period of the Judges, then to me, we can't say that there's a consistent, gradual decline into moral depravity if the worst things are happening at the beginning, right? And I think that might be part of the overarching strategy of the book. But I think that means that we have to do away with the downward spiral if it can't pass any of these tests.
Is this chronology something that appears in other interpreters throughout history?
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that within, I believe it's in Pseudo-Philo's retelling, and I think also in Josephus' telling, so the ancient sources, these sets of narratives are placed at the start of the Judges period. So they're retelling Israel's history, and sometimes they can add things in or leave things out. And, Pseudo-Philo is really fun. If you've never read it before, it's a blast. Josephus is a bit more straightforward, but both of these texts, they relocate these narratives to the start of the period because they've sensed that they actually begin there because of a kind of chronology. This kind of gets commented on. This is not like hidden secret knowledge or anything like that. But people have kind of gone out of their way to say, oh yeah, it just, it changes things, but it doesn't really change things. Or, I think one commentator talks about how, so Samson is located in the camp of Dan, and he's in this area of Zorah and Eshtaol, and those are locations also mentioned in chapters 17 and 18 of where Dan started, and then before they moved up north. And so because Samson seems to be located down here, where Dan is meant to be, or Dan starts in 17, it seems that the story of Samson is before chapters 17 and 18, or at least simultaneous. But some scholars note that, but then just kind of suggest, well, maybe Samson and his family, were the lone the people who stayed in their tribal allotment, and everyone else went up north, but they're the only ones that stayed. And it's like, well, maybe, but that seems like a stretch. That doesn't seem like that's the best way to take a silence in the text to suggest something like that. So people have noticed that, and the work that I'm really reliant on is David Feldman's completion of Judges, which is really good. It's talking about strategies of ending in Judges 17 to 25, and it's a fantastic book. But a lot of this kind of thinking about narrative time and dischronology and chronology is dependent upon that. And so he's all over my footnotes in this article in that section.
I think as you've been speaking, I've been thinking about the Twilight Zone comparison, because I don't know as much about Black Mirror, but I know, Rod Serling pops up to do the narration,
Mm-hmm.
and that's kind of what lends coherence to the body of work. Even though I feel like if you were to edit that out of every single episode and still just put them out there, whether it's like the guy in the space simulator where they're trying to trying to see if people can survive with no one around them, because he's in a town all by himself, or it's the guy who's in a library and then his glasses break. I feel like you could.
Yes. I know.
I feel
that
like
one
you
is
could.
like,
Yeah, that's actually my first example. I have to actively think for another one, so I don't only ever just say that one when I talk about Twilight Zone. But that it's a reflection on us, or the family that's all got all these horrible attributes, and they have to put masks on when they go to hear the reading of a will, and that it's a reflection of us morally. But there is this kind of coherence lended to it when Rod Serling pops up, and it almost seems like the pro monarchist propaganda of the, hey, everybody did whatever they wanted because they didn't have a king. Is that like a similar analog, or am I off base on that?
No. I think that's fair. So that and everyone did was right in his own eyes. There in those days, there's no king in Israel. That phrase only appears in chapters 17 through 21. So this part that a lot of people think is either an epilogue or an appendix, or kind of the ending of the book, but is a separate kind of literary unit than what comes before it with the themes of the major judges. I would say that this kind of the structural elements of and Israel did what was evil in the eyes of the Lord, and the Lord sold them or gave them or what. This type of language, I think, sound to me is the Rod Serling of and this week on, and you're now about to enter the Twilight Zone, right? Like that to me, that's the refrain that keeps coming up in all these stories. And sometimes it's louder, sometimes they're doing something interesting and not giving the exact same language, but it's similar enough to where you can hear and sense what type of text you're about to, or story you're about to hear. Black Mirror is it doesn't have the same type of narrator character like Rod Serling. But there's they all exist in the same moral universe and the same kind of cinematic universe, and so there's little Easter eggs that pop up between episodes where there's a symbol that's really important in one episode, and then later you see the same symbol kind of like in the background somewhere, or there's an object that was important for one story, and then it kind of shows up in another. And I think it's in season 2 or season 3 of the show where they have this museum, and it actually shows all of these various elements, icons, objects from the other Black Mirror episodes. And it shows it in this museum that a character visits and has this whole story. And so that actually reveals that it's all set in one universe. And much like the Twilight Zone is all kind of said the same thing, it's the story of the show Black Mirror is also getting at, it also functions as a social critique of ourselves, our reliance on technology, and it probes and asks really deep questions about what does it mean to be me, or what is the afterlife really like, and how should I act in this kind of chaotic world. And I think Judges is doing something really similar, in that it's asking what does it mean to follow the Lord while we're living in the land. and what kind of leadership structure, is it a king, is it a kind of tribal confederation, or is it a warlord, is it a prophet, like what's real, like what should be at the heart of our society. And I think the Book of Judges provides a variety of perspectives on that, but its coherence is maintained in the anthology, much like Twilight Zone and Black Mirror have, that Twilight Zone or Black Mirror, can provide all sorts of different understandings or takes or critiques on various social issues, but maintain their coherence because they're all part of one anthology and one collection.
Is there any part of the, I don't know, underlying or even surface messaging in Judges that is supportive of anything other than monarchy?
No, this is a great question. You've tapped into like 8 monographs and dissertations or something like that. So the point is that within the Book of Judges, we have different perspectives on monarchy. And the same thing happens in the Deuteronomistic history. At times, monarchy is the solution to the problem, right? That, oh yeah, it's going to be great, and I think that's one way of reading the refrain, right? In those days, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did was right with his own eyes. That you could read that as like, oh man, it was chaos. Yeah. And if only we had a king, that would solve the issue. Yeah. But other parts in the book, namely Abimelech, we have this story of, which is very fitting for today. I didn't know if I would be able to work this in, but there's this lovely story of Jotham, and he tells this fable about basically the lords of Shechem make Abimelech king. Abimelech has killed all his brothers, right? He is a bad person. He is not great. And he kills all his brothers. Not a great person, but one survives, Jotham. And he goes up and delivers this fable to the lords of Shechem. Basically, you wanted power, you wanted the keys to the kingdom, and this man promised you everything, and he accomplished it with violence, and he took it by force, and now you've cast your lot in with him. And but the bad thing is, he's a bad person, and he will turn on you, and he will devour you. So I really hope you like the person you voted for, right? And obviously they didn't vote, but to me, it's not a critique against the monarchy writ large, but it's very clear that you need to be absolutely careful who you let into power, right? Because you put the wrong person to power, everyone is going to die. And in the story, that actually happens. Like, everyone in the story dies, and yet also Abimelech is punished because God needs to have some justice, and the reader needs to have some justice in the story because the bad guy can't win. And so not at all relevant for today.
I'm assuming you're talking about Daenerys Targaryen. That's right?
Yes.
Yeah,
exactly.
Okay. Fair enough.
Exactly.
So that's so interesting that there are multiple perspectives in a finished product, because that is not common today, right?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think I think we're so used to coherence that we're always we're as humans, we love when things cohere with one another, and when they don't, it's really off-putting. And so any amount of coherence, when we have movies that are out of chronological order, we just like sometimes we just like we can't function, we can't like think about how they work, right? And so I think we're getting better at that now with various stories, because we can kind of it's a newish medium, but we can figure it out now. But we love coherence, and so we tend to smooth out those differences, which is exactly what I think the downward spiral has done. Is it smooths out? It sensed, rightfully so, it sensed some coherence, but in order to actually kind of emphasize the coherence, you had to smooth out the differences. And so part of what my article is trying to do is to go, okay, well, let's look at the text and look, oh, it's actually much more complex than you've made it sound. People are more complicated. Samson does good things. Ehud does bad things, at least within one kind of understanding of the narrative, right? And some people, are a mixed bag. And so we're so used to, the monologic discourse where there's one person speaking, there's one message, one kind of coherent theme throughout. But I think the book of Judges, I think the Bible more largely, but just focusing on the book of Judges right now, I think what's happening here as an anthology is each of these stories can have their own voice, and they can communicate their own message, and we don't necessarily need to harmonize them with one another. Though, because they exist in an anthology, we can draw those connections and draw those links, and have a richer understanding of each of the stories. But they can largely exist on their own terms, and they speak to a variety of themes, and they don't necessarily. We don't need to kind of smush them into one monologue, but they actually can function as a dialogue or as a multi-voice discourse.
So I had actually, I don't really read the questions. The only reason I was looking over at them so much today is because
The
the
ones
eight
you sent
tests.
me?
Well, yeah. Well, because I don't treat them like a checklist, but today,
Sure.
so I made a different version than what I sent
Oh, okay.
you that had the 8 rules listed out. But looking over, I tend to just kind of like, I don't really pay much attention to them. But I'd forgotten about question 7, which is kind of where we are right now in the conversation. So I said, what do you mean when you say, and this is a quote, there are clear signs of editorial activity in individual narratives and how they fit, quote, fit within the larger shape of the book? And what are the underlying traditions that indicates they were not haphazardly arranged? So it's interesting that I noticed that when I glanced over, because while you were
Hmm.
speaking, I was wondering, it seems like, please tell me, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like part of your work is identifying where you see these seams and trying to understand the seams between the stories helps you understand motivations for why those seams are there and why those stories are there. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, a lot of the work of identifying those seams in the kind of editing, has largely been done, a long time ago. So, I'm inheriting a lot of those observations. I mean, some really basic ones is that the book looks to be in a tripart structure, right? Chapters 1 and 2 as a prologue, 3 through 16 as the main body of the text, and 17 through 21 as the kind of epilogue or appendix or ending, whatever you want to call it. But then we have little bits of, things that look like earlier traditions that are kind of preserved alongside later ones. So, classic one is Judges 4 and 5. So you have the narrative version of the story of Deborah and Barak, and then chapter 5 has a poetic version. And they, I think largely cohere, but they have different emphasis and they have different, characters and, parts of the story, though they seem to be speaking to the same kind of event or the same, tradition that's lying beneath it. But they both sit next to each other, and we're better off for having both of them. You also get that Jotham's fable, which I just mentioned. It seems really out of place in the story. Both just kind of on a narrative level, but also, the text doesn't actually mention anyone by name. It's a fable. And then there's a very lengthy explanation spelling out, by the way, Abimelech is the bad guy, and you are this person in this. Like it's almost like, Aslan is Jesus type of level of explanation. Like, just make sure Aslan is Jesus. Like, that's kind of how it feels. So there's a variety of things within the text that we can see that there's this earlier tradition. This is part of why I think the minor judges, the list of names, and they don't really do anything, but they're counted as judges. This seems to be an earlier part of the tradition that has been preserved in the text, and I think they can have some kind of theological or literary function in the narrative. But they seem to be residue is probably not the right word, but I'm going to use it anyways. A residue of earlier traditions that are kind of still in the text that we have received. I think I mentioned in the article, but they actually break up the downward spiral. So I've really never understood why, because the downward spiral, in my opinion, just is really selective in its evidence. And one of those things is you have to skip over these characters because they don't have enough information in them to tell you why they're worse than other people in the text, because you know, they have cities, and you're like, that's Eve. That's worse than killing your daughter? Question mark. I don't know about that. So a lot of things I think disrupt this downward spiral, which is really the point of the story. Or sorry, the point of the article is really to. It's my pet peeve. Is just to push back on this thing that I just don't think exists, and I want people to start appreciating the Book of Judges as an anthology, and I think that will open up the text to better readings and more interesting ones.
I like that. So it's not that you're saying the downward spiral is a claim made in bad faith. It can be good faith, but it's not the best reading of the text.
Yeah, and the first part of the argument is kind of tracing where this language comes from, and pinpointing exactly when it enters the kind of judges scholarship in the 1980s. And I try to I am I'm not trying to critique any of these people per se, um, who espouse this type of reading, because I really appreciate this idea of like, well, yeah, this isn't just haphazardly arranged traditions that have kind of accreted over time. Like, there is a rhyme and reason to why they're here, and they tell a really interesting story, and it's more than just for fun or good toilet humor, something to read on the airplane. It's something compelling about these stories, and I think that's partly because there's a purpose to them, and probably several purposes uh, to the stories and the collections. So I do want to see this level of coherence. I'm pushing back and saying the coherence isn't found in a structural reading that sees the Book of Judges as a downward spiral, because I just don't see it in the text.
Fair enough. Is there anything that I didn't ask about that you were hoping I would ask about? And there's plenty in the article that I did not bring up.
No, they can read the article.
Yeah. Yeah. Get to it, folks. Where would you send people to get a better understanding of Judges? And are there even downward spiral advocates that you would say this is a particularly good or thoughtful representation? And if the answer is no, that's fine. You're not here to advocate for them.
I think perhaps what I'd say is this. Yeah. Where can people go to find out more about Judges? Well, the thing about this anthology reading is that if we understand the individual stories to be able to stand alone, then people can go basically anywhere they want. There's going to be good readings of that story. There's going to be less than good readings of that story. There's going to be plenty of journal articles on each of these individual narratives, and other ones that kind of take a broader look at a theme or a broader look at the story. So there's lots of places you can go to learn more about Judges. I would say that one of the kind of the very helpful books that kind of at least has helped me to understand a little bit more about what I'm doing when I'm reading text is a book by Andrew Judd called Modern Genre Theory. It's just come out with Zondervan, Zondervan Academic, I think. And it just looks at, he's a literary critic and also, a biblical scholar as well. And he just looks at how modern genre theory can help us really understand and appreciate the text with some really creative ways. And so he has actually a chapter on Judges 19 where he reads it as a horror story. I think it's a very compelling way of reading. But I think people would be benefit not from just learning about how to use genre appropriately and in a better sense for the Book of Judges, but also he works through a lot of different sections of the Bible. So I think your listeners would and everyone would benefit from that book.
I don't think I'd heard of that. I'll look into that. A better way maybe of framing it then might be, is there a particular, since most of my listeners probably are speaking, I hope, are speaking English, because this will be nonsense if you don't speak English, is there a particular English translation of the Bible that you would recommend for reading the book of Judges? You okay?
No, no.
No, there isn't one?
Um, no, 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 no. I no, I my um. I think most translations are just as good as one another. I don't think necessarily there is going to be a better one than the other. I think the standard NIV, great. NASB, great. ESV, sure, why not? NRSV, excellent. The best thing you can do is learn Hebrew, and that'd be excellent. But I know that not everyone has time for that, so that's why you let me do it. Um, but no, but I think any of these English translations are going to provide a faithful rendering of these stories, and people can still glean so much from these texts.
So I can tell you this right now. My best friend Daniel, he hears all the interviews before anybody else does. He's kind of a silent partner on this. He's been on the podcast,
Cool,
so
cool,
if
cool.
regular listeners will know who I'm talking about. You just made him very happy, and I think you may be his favorite guest ever now. So
Awesome.
Daniel Rodriguez, you're welcome. A guest finally said, unprompted, learn biblical languages.
Yes, this
So
is yes.
go ahead. What were you saying?
Oh, I was just gonna say yes. This is what I say. I mean, my students ask me this all the time, and it's like, yeah, I mean, any of these are fine, but maybe you should just learn biblical language if you really want to learn it. Then do it. You can do it. It's not easy, but it's not the hardest thing in the world. And there are so many wonderful um, resources out there and cheap classes you can take online. And even if part of doing languages and learning biblical texts is right. It's not meant, it's a lifelong kind of commitment. Yeah. Just like if you are committed to reading these texts as scripture, then you're committing your life to them as well. So you could probably learn some Hebrew. You could probably learn some Greek, and you'll have a lot of fun.
Fair enough. I'm sure they're tired of hearing me say it. I know the episode that actually came out yesterday, the guest suggested, I think it's a YouTube channel, a Left with Beth. I think that's a
Aleph with Beth.
like,
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
yeah. Um,
It's great.
okay. What do you read for fun?
What do I read for fun? See, I knew you were going to ask me this question because I listened to your podcasts, and so
You
I
just
was
became
meant to
my
have
favorite
it.
guest
Thank
by
yes,
saying
I
that to me.
checking the box. Yeah, no. I mainly audiobook because I do have a small child and I do not have time to sit down and read. And normally, because I read for my day job, I tend to watch more television or films uh, in the evenings because I like that. But time to time, I'll listen to podcasts. I mean, it's election season, so I just been doom listening to various podcasts. Um, Informed listening, I should say. Um, so I like all sorts of literature, though. Science fiction, kind of fantasy type of books. I don't prefer. I don't really prefer biography type of books. I don't know why. It's just not necessarily my thing. But so I like reading all sorts of things. But at the moment, I've just been kind of listening to podcasts and trying to stave off the existential dread.
What TV? What if you were when you go home today, if you're gonna watch something, what are you gonna watch?
This is the problem. I think I might watch too much TV because I'm out of television shows. Like if you name it, like I probably have seen it. I was watching Shrinking on Apple TV. That was great. Loved
Okay.
that. Watched recently We Own the City. It's a HBO show. It's very depressing about the police. Not a great show about police corruption in Baltimore, but it's made by the same people who made The Wire. So if you really like The Wire, then this is the show for you. Some of the cast from The Wire is in this show as well as different characters. But that was like the last kind of like major show that I watched altogether, or like binge watched.
I pretty much watch the same 6 shows on repeat. So I mean, it's like New Girl, Community, Parks and Rec. Drawn a blank on what else. Oh
The
man,
Office.
You know what? No, 30 Rock. I've watched 30
30
Rock
Rock?
4 or 5 times in the last, not calendar year, but in the last actual 365 days. I'm on this loop. I just want to keep rewatching 30 Rock. And the
It's
older
great.
I've gotten, I've learned terms like neurodivergent. I don't have a diagnosis, so I'm not doing that here. But the fact that I watch the same shows on repeat and I find great comfort in it. My wife has her shows, but she'll just pick them up at random points. But it's like, no, it's time to watch Community again. We start with the pilot and we work all the way through, except for season 4 because we don't watch season 4. It's not my fault they fired Dan Harmon. Anyway, I won't. I won't waste any more of your time. Unless you have anything else, I appreciate you being here, and I'm going to call this one good.
Yeah, it's been a blast talking to you. You've been my favorite person because now you just asked me all these questions about judges, and I'm like, great. I just want everyone to ask me these questions about judges.
This
Probably run
this is
away,
the best
but, like,
election day ever.
yeah, well, that remains to be seen. But
we get to create that reality. At any rate, Brendan Hurlbert, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for listening. I really do look forward to any feedback that I get that would help make the podcast better, help me understand what I'm doing well or what I'm doing poorly. So please reach out to me and give me a heads up on that. What you're about to hear is a preview of my conversation with Matthew Monger on his Journal of Biblical Literature article, The Book of the Daughters of Adam in the Galatian Decree. It was a very interesting conversation for me because even though I am not an expert at all in any of the conversations that I have, this was a discussion on a subject that I knew literally nothing about, and that is documents that are old, but not quite as old as biblical texts, but catalog biblical texts. And so there is scholarly work being done to understand even those texts. So it was a lot of fun. So that's all from me. Here's a preview of the conversation that'll be available next week with Matthew Monger. Thanks. Take care.
This article actually came out of a project that I was doing at the Norwegian Academy of Sciences that 2 colleagues of mine put together, which was called Books Known Only by Title. And so they were studying the phenomenon of books being mentioned in other texts, but not actually existing in reality, or we having no trace of them. And sometimes that is a product of just kind of literary fantasy, right? So things that you would find in certain types of literature would just be books that are thrown out there. And we find that a similar sort of thing in the Bible, even that we have these kind of books that are mentioned that we don't actually know whether they existed. Like in the book of Kings or in the book of Chronicles, it might mention the books of the annals of the kings of Judah and stuff like that. And we don't know if they exist because we don't have them, but they might exist. And so what we were doing was looking for examples of this from the different fields that we work in. And because I have studied the book of Jubilees quite a bit, this was something that I had run across in my studies of the book of Jubilees, because this particular entry, the book of the daughters of Adam, is also called the book of the daughters of Adam of Leptogenesis, which is the Greek name for the book of Jubilees.